Awesome. First of all, thank you very much. Great to be here with you all today. I love the Halloween background, by the way. That's super cool from that perspective. So, guys, very very excited to be with you all today. What we're gonna do over the next couple of minutes is basically I want to share with you all some of the latest developments we are seeing in the exciting world of central bank digital currency, and hopefully my goal is to share with you some of these latest developments and let you make your own decision on what you think the impact it can have on the not only the future of the crypto ecosystem, but also the broader ramifications on the financial sector. Are you guys ready? Here we go. So let's go. You can see on the first slide what we have here is just a couple of 5 big trends, but I'm really going to focus on CBDCs today. But it's important we remember, as we discussed throughout this conference, this is part of the whole broader changes going on. But I'm a big believer that CBDCs, as you see on the next slide, are a very important topic. But first, to start, on the next slide, you see what is a CBDC. So I think it's important I put my professor hat on for a quick second here, and just to clarify, what we mean to CBDC is a digital form of central bank money that is issued by the central bank and is part of the monetary base of the economy. And why this is relevant is what you'll see on the next slide is actually today, when you think about money, money as we know it, there's really 2 kinds of central bank money that we have today. It's obviously good old cash that you hold in your hand. And second one is actually the reserves that your bank holds at the central bank. So these are really the 2 kinds of central bank money that we have today. The money that you have at your bank is actually just debits and credits, kind of accounting entries on the ledger of the bank. It is not central bank money. What's really exciting now is that for the first time in a very long time, we may have a third form of central bank money in the form of a CBDC, and that's super, super exciting. And this is why, if you go on the next slide, you'll see that's what there's been a lot of discussions on CBDC in recent months, a lot of the conversations and discussions around the topic. And actually, when you look at some of the benefits of it, makes sense as well. For example, for a lot of central banks, having a CBDC allows them to have better visibility on what's happening, on their impact of their monetary policy. Today, when you're using cash, the central bank has absolutely no idea where that money is being used or where it's being spent. Second, obviously, it helps when it comes to countering the black economy, people at tax evasion, because again, there's visibility from that perspective. There's obviously a massive debate on privacy that I'll touch in a couple seconds, but I think that's something that's important to understand. Another big development, but positive with CBDCs, is that for the first time in a very long time, they give us a fighting chance against money laundering. Today, when you're using cash, if you want to buy drugs, you want to launder money, cash is the best because nobody knows where it's gone, where it's being traced, and so on and so forth. But when we're talking about actually CBDC, for the first time, we may actually have a fighting chance to go to one of the biggest challenges we have right now in the global economy. And I'll talk about some of the other elements as well in a couple of minutes. As you'll see on the next slide here, really what's important, that's what there's been numerous discussions in the media and from policymakers on CBDC because of some of the benefits that I mentioned. And what you'll see on the next slide is that today, there's about 80% of central banks who are doing some kind of research, pilots, or activity on this space. But it was not always like this. For example, if you on the next slide, you see a couple of years ago, in 2018, the BIS was quite negative on CBDCs and crypto more generally, saying that actually decentralized technologies of cryptocurrencies is a poor substitute for the solid institutional backing of money. Well, they were not alone. On the next slide, where you see the ECB, the European Central Bank, saying actually this could cause a CBDC could cause problems. For one of the reasons is that today, if you do not trust the banking system anymore, you can go through your ATM, withdraw cash, but there's obviously physical limitations to how much you can withdraw and actually how you're going to be able to store it securely. The big difference now is actually when you look at how he operates with the CBDC, you could technically withdraw as much as you want on your wallet, that's why actually in an event of a financial crisis, whenever there's financial stability, it may actually accelerate a run on the banks, and that's why a lot of central banks are very afraid. But all of this changed when in June 2019, as you saw a couple seconds ago, Libra was announced. Of course, Libra completely catalyzed this conversation. As I often half-jokingly say in the crypto ecosystem, I think we all have to send a bouquet of flowers to Mark Zuckerberg and to the Facebook and the broader Libra community for having brought this topic on top of the agenda. I generally believe things would have not moved so quickly if but for Libra being announced in the summer of 2019. But there was obviously a lot of reaction to it at the time. We all remember the words from the Donald Trump, as you see on the next slide. We're saying that there's only one strong currency, and it's the U.S. dollar. Or even as you see on the next slide, what actually some of the letters that the companies that were part of the initial Libra got from politicians in the U.S. saying that in the event they get involved in Libra activity, they will get investigated, not only for the Libra activity, but for all other payment activities. So this is why there was a lot of buzz around this, a lot of discussions, and a lot of concerns, as you see on the next slide, from policymakers around the world. People wondering, okay, in the event we have this global currencies, global stablecoin, what's going to be the impact? And they're right to a certain extent. There are some very serious concerns. For example, when you see on the next slide, the BIS has mentioned numerous times that this may create a global stablecoin, could create a challenge to monetary sovereignty. Think about it's so very easy to send money and receive money with Libra. Migrant workers and many alike are using Libra stablecoins on the platform. What's going to happen with some of the currencies of smaller countries? Is there a risk actually of having currency substitution? So these are some of the concern that was actually being raised by many policymakers, including the BIS, but also on broader financial stability, as you see on the next slide, right? This broader with the risk that it can cause to broader financial stability by the effect of having some of these coins. But another good example is what we saw with the ECB on the next slide, which is basically, there's a real risk not only of bank runs, like I mentioned before, that I could withdraw my money very quickly, move it to CBDC on my wallet, and I don't have the issues that I have with cash, but also that it can affect bank funding. For example, today, when you're depositing money in a bank, your bank is able to actually lend this money out and actually generate revenues and profits out of that cheap funding that you're able to provide in exchange of a small interest you're being paid. But actually, in the event that more and more people are keeping their money in CBDC, then a lot of the banks need to go get funding on the wholesale level. It actually may have an impact on their revenues from that perspective. So very interesting what's happening there. So a lot of these debates were going on, discussions were going on, things were moving relatively fast until, of course, COVID happened, as we all know, and COVID really acted in many regards as a further catalyst to CBDC. I'll give you some examples. The first one, when you look at the next slide, is actually during the crisis, people didn't want to touch banknotes, because of the fear that it may actually, accelerate or propagate the virus. With actually people looking at paper bills and saying, well, there's a risk actually that a lot of these paper bills that I have may actually share the virus. So a lot of people, less and less people using it for payments. But also then you saw another ironic problem happen at the same time. While less and less people were using cash for payments, more and more people were keeping cash with them, hoarding cash. If you look right now, in many parts of the world, we are actually at record levels of cash in the system. Why? And this is something that happens a lot in events of financial stability. People hoard cash whenever things become risky or there's a financial uncertainty. Again, and this actually, ironically, while less and less people are using it for payments, more and more people are hoarding it. And this creates an issue for a central bank. Particularly when you look at the last one, the other big challenge that happened was that we realized on the next slide it was difficult to distribute COVID-19 funds. We all know how the US IRS had to send over 100 million checks by post because there was no way of reaching the people who needed the most. So all of these elements, actually, ironically, COVID really brought back and accelerated discussion and debate around CBDCs. And this is why you had numerous discussions around the world on this topic. But before we move forward, I think it's very important that I really clarify a couple of things. First of all, again, putting my professor hat back on, as you see on the next slide, it's very important to demystify, understand there are two kinds of CBDC right now in the market. The first one is what we call wholesale CBDC. What is wholesale CBDC? It's really kind of digital currency that is issued by the central bank, but it's only between the central bank and its various member banks. You, as a member of the public, me, we do not interact with it. It's really it's something that happens behind the scenes and affects kind of the piping, if you want, of CBD of the financial system. What's really exciting? It's on the right side. It's which is retail CBDC, and this is a digital currency that is issued by the central bank that you and I and the public can actually interact with. It's literally the third form of central bank money that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, and that's super exciting because when you look at this, there's different ways this is being approached around the world. When you look at the next slide, there's been different approaches to CBDC in each one of the categories. For example, let me start quickly with when you look at the wholesale category, which is the one on the left side. You know, if you look at any country, within a country, as you see on the left side column here, the payment systems may not be perfect, but they work okay. Most countries right now have what we call RTGS systems, real-time gross settlements. So when you're trying to make payments within a country, I mean, think about the country you're in right now. Within the country, it works normally relatively well. The problem becomes, at the second column, at the cross-border level. When we're trying to make payments cross-border today, the average fees around the world is around 7%. There's around, 250 million migrants sending over $500 billion a year. So it's a really big problem from that perspective, and it's an issue. And this is why, when you look at the next slide, there's been a lot of efforts being done at the wholesale level. Probably the one model that I think the most advanced right now, when you look in the world, is really what's happening between Thailand and Hong Kong. It's called Project Line Rock, Itonal, a very, very interesting project, what's happening from that perspective. What's interesting there, if you look at it, if you move to the next, what you'll see here is actually the two central banks are come together, and they create this corridor in the middle. And actually what happens is actually whenever banks want to get into that corridor, basically just the central bank mints kind of a stablecoin equivalent that is called deposit receipt, and they're able to actually change it. So a bank can correspond with another bank within the corridor, literally completely bypassing the correspondent banking system. And that's super exciting. But again, if you see what you look at this model that you have right now, what's really exciting for a lot of people is what's happening at the retail CBDC level, which are the models you're seeing on the right side. And here again, there's a couple of models that are being explored right now around the world. For example, let me start with the first one, which is a two-tiered issuance. If you go on the next slide, you'll see the model that is there in detail. There's been a couple of countries that are looking at this very actively right now. Sweden here is a good example with the 2020 Riksbank project. China right now with the CP, I'll talk about China in a second, but the Bahamas, the Eastern Caribbean, a lot of them have adopted this model. Why? It's basically the central bank issues a digital currency, but it's distributed to the public via the existing financial institutions. So for the financial institutions, this is great. It does not disrupt the system too much. So that the public has access to a third form of central bank money, but the kind of distribution happens via the existing financial players. So a lot of pros and cons there. For a lot of central banks, the good news there, it does not disrupt the system too much. It's still pretty stable from a financial stability perspective, but at least it gives the people the chance to hold a third form of central bank money. The second model that we've been discussing a lot in policy circles right now is one we call the synthetic CBDC. I like to call it the IMF proposal, and this is a controversial one, by the way, as controversial as it gets in policymaker circles. Many, including the BIS, many central banks would argue that this is not a real CBDC. What's this model? The way the synthetic CBDC works is that you have actually a financial institution or a non-bank fintech that has an account at the central bank, and that whenever it's able to issue a kind of a CBDC, but that is backed one-to-one by reserves at the central bank. Many would argue that this is not a real CBDC when it comes from that perspective, but again, I think it's important that we address it here. It's not very dissimilar to the concept of narrow banking that was discussed a couple of years ago in the US, which are banks that hold your assets and they're not able to conduct activities with those funds. But the third model I think we should discuss is the next slide, which is the platform approach, which is probably popularized. Sweden talked about it a lot a couple of years ago, but probably the UK in their latest 2020 January proposal, where basically the central bank, look, I'm simplifying a lot, but basically comes up with a technological platform model that then players, financial institutions and non-banks, fintechs can actually plug into that tech ecosystem from that perspective. So very interesting, the different approaches, but at the end of the day, what these different models are doing is to actually deliver central bank money to the hands of the people. But what's really important to all of you who are watching this is actually to understand there's actually even more distinctions when you look at the types of CBDCs. When you go to the next slide, you'll see that each basically retail CBDC can be either token-based or account-based. What is token-based? Is basically allows two people, to have, for example, can have the CBDC on their wallet and are able to exchange it between themselves as they wish to do so. The good news is it works offline. However, the problem with this, there's no real way of checking who is giving the money to whom. This way, there's a bit of risk of money laundering. And this is why for a lot of token models that we're looking right now, there's kind of a maximum cap of how much can be exchanged. Very similar to right now to, let's say, gift card models that we have. The other model is what we call the account-based, where really it's kind of like very similar to a bank account right now, where it's more online. But again, it does not really help on some of the core goals of CBDCs, like financial inclusion, for example. Actually, a good example, in many cases, it can be both. A good example is actually good old cash, is a good example of a central bank money that is both token-based, because I can give you the money physically offline, but there's also account-based as the money that you have in your bank account. So very important distinction, I think, for everybody at home to be familiar with. But it's also important to understand that there are some different models as well. The one of you today I'm not going to discuss, it's the next slide, is really decentralized CBDC. And this slide is actually a bit inaccurate, because this is actually the Marshall Islands is the best example. They're issuing the SOV, which will come up next year, and that is actually a fully decentralized currency issued by a country. The only big difference I would say here is that it's actually, there's no central bank in the Marshall Islands. So it's going to be a very good experience to see how this is going to flow through for next year. But all these discussions are very, very good. But again, I think the big game changer here is coming again by the next slide, again by Libra, with their Libra 2.0 that came up. And as you'll see on the next slide, what they did, they made some changes that came into force. And on the next slide, you'll see really how Libra 2.0 is operating, where basically it's kind of a stable coin that is backed by USD, GBP, Japanese yen, Singapore dollars, and so on and so forth. It's regulated. All the participants on the ecosystem are also regulated players, or there's a KYC that is being done. So actually the benefit there is that actually each one of these Libra coins initially was one global currency. Now they're kind of like a single currency stable coins that are fully backed. So it's going to be very interesting to see the impact this may have on the broader CBDC discussion that is taking place. But also the one country you need to keep an eye on when it comes to CBDCs is, you may have guessed it, China. Of course, China is years ahead of many other countries in the world. The PBOC has been exploring this topic since 2014. Yes, 2014, when most countries were not even looking at this. And I mean, even recently, as you see on the next slide, they officially launched their pilot. And that pilot is very exciting. If you look at the next slide on a DCEP, the work has started a couple of years ago. The goal is, again, to replace paper notes and coins. China is already de facto cashless in any event. But again, the goal was really to make it eliminate paper notes and actually give people access to central bank money on which the central bank has visibility. And on this note, as you see on this slide, China is years ahead of any other country. In the recent experimentation they did, I mean, this is a pilot, by the way. Over 160 million US dollars was handled in the first pilot. Over 6,700 use cases. Over 110,000 retail wallets were used. So again, it's a different scale of what's happening from that perspective, and also some quite innovative ideas as well. As you see on the next slide, they even launched a lottery last weekend in Shenzhen, where the government made this lottery that 50,000 people won about $30 in CBDC money, and they're able to spend it. And actually over 15 million people participated. So again, great way to create awareness and knowledge on the topic of CBDC. Very, very interesting. And really, I'll finish up with something that happened today, yesterday on the next slide, but really what's happening with payment firms. You may say, okay, what's happening with a lot of payment firms over the last couple of months, but what's happening with PayPal. They announced, with their announcement they made, that initially they're going to offer BTC at Litecoin and Bitcoin Cash, initially only to US users, but with the goal to expanding to global markets by the first half of 2021. Very interesting there what's going to happen. The reason I think you may say this is very good, The reason is actually PayPal explicitly mentioned that they're going to actually explore partnerships with other central banks around the world over the coming months. So definitely an area to watch what's happening with PayPal. On a more broader level, what I think is some of the areas to watch over the next couple of months, what's happening with China, you need to keep an eye on. What's happening with broader CBDC activity with other central banks and the BIS. Libra, what's going to happen, and especially now, not only Libra, but also the PayPal and how that's going to come up. And last but not least, a topic that is very relevant to CBDCs is really what's happening with stablecoins. Really very, very important what's happening on the stablecoin side. There's 20 billion now in assets in stablecoins. I firmly believe the speed of adoption and usage of stablecoins will have an impact on the speed and development of CBDCs. That's all the time I have today for you all. For all of you who want to join me on the next slide, what you'll see is every video, every week, I have a show on LinkedIn called the Crypto Capsule, where I summarize in 60 seconds the developments you need to know that week in the crypto space. I also have a weekly newsletter called The Future of Money. All of this is on LinkedIn. You can find the QR code here, but also on Twitter if you're looking for my daily updates. And on YouTube, my YouTube page, where I have a lot of interviews and my shows, everything is there. So again, guys, thank you very much. It was great sharing my passion of the future of money with you all. And I'll pass it back to you guys with the Halloween decor in the background. Thank you very much, everybody. It was great being with you all today.